catecholamines refer to these three neurotransmitters. I try to tell my students to remember the cat is in the den. Okay, just so it might help you out. And then you could remember S, serotonin, sleep, maybe. Okay, so the catecholamines, as you can see, look, it starts with dopamine here, and then all you have to do is add one oxygen-hydrogen bonds right here, and you get the norepinephrine. But then norepinephrine turns into epinephrine by just one more bond right here. So basically, dopamine turns into the norepinephrine, which turns into epinephrine, and this tells us a lot about behavior. So dopamine, to me, is one of the coolest neurotransmitters. This is your molecule for pleasure. So when you feel pleasure, when you feel really good pleasure, like, wow, I feel great. This one's more the mood, like I'm in a depressed mood or I'm in an okay mood, but this one is true pleasure, like when you have an orgasm, that would be the release of dopamine. They believe that when you fall in love, that's the release of dopamine. And in fact, I ask my students as I say, okay class, when can you know the difference between love and lust? And they kind of mill around, and basically what we find is for the first 7 months when you fall in love, then you almost become obsessed with the other person. A lot of people become obsessed, just constantly thinking about the other person. You can't wait to see them, so on and so forth. And then after 7 months, the obsessive compulsiveness, the activation of the caudate nucleus in the brain, it kind of subsides, and then your relationship becomes very positive but a little bit more realistic. But then what happens at about the 2-year mark is that's when, unless you have a strong friendship or a strong commitment, that you might turn to the person and say, you know, I don't really feel the same way about you that I used to. So maybe, you know, you've been seeing the other person through rose-colored glasses, they say, and then all of a sudden around the 2-year mark, the glasses come off and you start to see the person as they are. And you don't feel that high, that rush when you're around them. So basically what they think that is you develop a tolerance to that person releasing the dopamine for you. So when you fall in love, when you're with this person, it releases dopamine and you feel high, you feel giddy, you feel great. But then after about 2 years, that particular stimulus no longer produces the dopamine. So then kind of what we call as love junkies is now you say, well, you don't make me feel the way you used to, so now you look for someone else and you want them to make you feel the way you used to, so now you find someone else, and sure enough you feel that rush, you feel that giddiness again. But then after about 2 years that's going to subside too, which is fine. You can keep going from partner to partner for, you know, every 2 years, but if you're looking for stability and you're looking for a long-term commitment, you have to be realistic, and you have to know that that person probably isn't going to stimulate the dopamine forever, unless and that's why actually a relationship where there is some conflict and there is some the person kind of pushes you to try new things or kind of questions you, kind of makes you adapt to them, a lot of times can be more stimulating than someone that's kind of always there for us. There's no surprise, so on and so forth. Whenever we have surprise or novelty or something unexpected or there's risk involved, then kind of we release the dopamine. So dopamine is also released in response to novelty, and that's why surprise and mystery is something that can give us a lot of pleasure. Another thing that dopamine is involved in is it's involved in movement. So, for example, Parkinson's disease is a disease where I think a lot of you know that. I'm sorry that this is so messy, but here we should put movement right here. Okay, so this is for movements. Okay, so Michael J. Fox has the Parkinson's disease. What happens with that is your arms and they start to shake. You get tremors. You can't control them. Your legs could shake. Your limbs, sometimes they become rigid, so you can't move them. Um, and so that's a lack of dopamine. So there was this guy, and he had these terrible Parkinsonian symptoms, and what he did was he went to see this doctor that was about 2,000 miles away from his house, and he wanted this new drug. They actually have synthesized the L-Dopa makes more dopamine, and so the drug L-Dopa is used to create more dopamine to combat the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. If you saw that movie, it's an old movie now, but with Awakenings, and it had Robin Williams in it, and they had given all these old people this drug, and it suddenly made them young, and they became more sexual, and they had more energy, and so on and so forth. That was the L-Dopa, actually, that they had used. So this guy goes to see the doctor 2,000 miles away and says, I really need this drug that you're prescribing to everybody. It's called L-Dopa, and my Parkinsonian symptoms are so terrible. Would you please consider giving me this drug? And so the doctor said, okay, well, you look like a good candidate for this drug, but I'm curious, why did you come so far? And the guy got really nervous, and he says, my sister, she lives here, and so I came to stay with my sister, and I heard you were an excellent doctor, and so I wanted to see if you would prescribe me this drug. So the doctor did prescribe the drug, and the man was hospitalized for, they were watching him under the influence of the new drug because it was new at the time in the testing trials. So in most people, the drug would take about a week or so to kick in. And but for him, within a couple of days, I mean, he started walking everywhere. I mean, his limbs became less rigid, and he just walked everywhere, and he was just out and doing this. And the nurses were like, well, he must be really happy to capture his limbs back, so that's why he's walking so much. He's just all over the halls, so on and so forth. But then after a few more days, his walk became a march. And so now he was marching up and down the halls, just back and forth, and the nurses, kind of thinking, well, this is kind of strange, okay. But then after a few more days on the drug, his march became like he started isolating himself in the room. He started acting kind of paranoid. He'd be peeking around the doors. He refused to eat any hospital meals. He wouldn't let the nurses touch anything that he had. And so the nurses kind of went to the doctor and said, doctor, we have some concerns about this patient. You need to check in on him. He was walking up and down the halls, and then the walk became a march, and then now he's isolated himself in the room, but he's like won't allow any of us in, and he's showing all these symptoms. So the doctor goes to see him at the door, and he says, hello, yeah, can I come in and talk to you? And he barely opens the door just a crack, and he says, doctor, are you alone? And the doctor says, yes, I'm alone. Are any of those nurses with you? No, they're not with me. Okay, come in. So the doctor comes in, and the guy's got all these pizza boxes stacked up and all these Pepsi bottles, and then there's like all these shades over the windows and kind of like all this stuff on his room like a barricade. And the doctor's like, wow, this is kind of strange. And he says, what's going on? And the patient says, doctor, I have a plan to save the world. I can make this place a better place. And so the doctor listens to his whole plan, and he's like, oh, okay. But then the doctor says, what about all these pizza boxes and Pepsis? He goes, well, those nurses out there. Those nurses, they're trying to steal this plan from me, and they are plotting to kill me. They're going to assassinate me. That's why you have to be alone. I have to get out of here, doctor, because if they get to me, I'm going to be killed. Okay. So by me telling you this story, can any of you think of what symptoms that kind of shows? Okay, that would be kind of a schizophrenic delusion. So unfortunately, dopamine, low levels of dopamine can be related to Parkinson's disease, but high dopamine activity is related to schizophrenia. So I'd like you to know that low dopamine activity, low levels of dopamine is associated with Parkinson's disease, but high levels of dopamine activity is associated with schizophrenia. So unfortunately for this man, as he had tried the L-Dopa again and again with different doctors throughout the United States, and every time by raising his levels of dopamine, it would put him into the schizophrenic delusions. His brain was set up, and the effect that for whatever reason the L-Dopa actually triggered the schizophrenic delusions. So each time he had to be taken off. But then his Parkinsonian symptoms would come back very hard, and of course he would hate those symptoms and want to try again if only we can find the right dose or the right setup. So it's kind of a tragic story. But now let's look at how this works, because this is really, really interesting, the catecholamines and how they work as far as behavior. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are released during times of stress because, look, epinephrine and norepinephrine, when they're in their brain, they're called epinephrine, norepinephrine. But when they're in the body, they are called adrenaline and noradrenaline. So whenever we have stress, we release epinephrine and norepinephrine. But this explains a lot about behavior. One thing is that what we have what research has determined is, well, let me just ask you first, is I want you to think about the thing in your life that you are most proud of. The thing that when you think about it, you say, you know what? I got a lot of satisfaction from that. I felt my ultimate satisfaction. Okay, did you think of it? Okay, now I am going to venture to guess what it is. I say that it is something where you had a challenge and you experienced some pretty severe stress, but you were able to come through and overcome that challenge. So some of you might say, oh, I had this big job to do, or I produced this incredible event, or I could be graduated from high school. But basically, I'm going to say that you cannot feel satisfaction without stress. What do you think about that? Is it possible to feel a deep sense of satisfaction without experiencing stress? I don't think so. Now maybe you can argue with me, but basically what they found that produces satisfaction is produced from the catecholamines, the stress hormones, the combination of stress and dopamine. I tell my students, I can tell them the best sex that they're ever going to have. Now you have to know that I teach the human sexuality class, so it's actually appropriate. So I tell them, you know what, I'll know your best sexual encounter. I can tell you what it is. And they say, oh yeah, well what is it going to be? As I said, here it is probably the best sex you're ever going to have is when you do it with someone either you're not supposed to be doing it with, or you're doing it in a place that you shouldn't be doing it, or it was something that you never thought that you'd be doing or you totally weren't expecting. Because basically dopamine is released in response to novelty, and then you have pleasure. But then when you have the epinephrine and norepinephrine release stress, you're not supposed to be doing it, you're doing it with somebody you shouldn't be doing it, then that increases the need for more dopamine to be released, because the dopamine has to also turn into the norepinephrine and epinephrine. So probably your greatest high will be from the mixture of dopamine, a pleasurable event that has stress, But now this is where we get addictions. Is basically all addictive behaviors result from you needing more dopamine. So all addictive drugs facilitate the release of dopamine. But then when the person is stressed, I can't get this drug, or I'm not supposed to be having this drug, then the person becomes more addicted to it, and the more need. Gambling addiction is you've got the huge risk that's involved. So you've got the stress here. So that's releasing the epinephrine, norepinephrine, which is kind of depleting the dopamine. So then you need more and more of the pleasure high to make up for the lost epinephrine, norepinephrine. A sexual addiction. You'll see that people turn to their addictions when they get under stress, because let's say they're under stress at work. So if they're under stress at work, they're depleting their epinephrine, norepinephrine. So now what they need is they seek the pleasure to release more dopamine so that the dopamine can make up for the stress hormones of epinephrine and norepinephrine being released. So if you have a shopping addiction, or if you have an eating addiction, or if you have a sexual addiction or a person addiction,
Summon the Prince of Temptation. For what purpose?
Oh, shit. I have addiction demons and I don't understand them.
Then allow me to explain the darkness of the human soul. So you've got dopamine, right? That's the chemical that gets released in your brain whenever you do something pleasurable, like eating, sex, and that's just nature, right? Like rabbits and fish and shit. They need dopamine so that they want to consume and reproduce.
Okay.
But because humans have progressed and now have access to all the shit they want whenever they want it, it's easy for them to overdo and have dopamine problems. You know, it's not fucking rocket science, this stuff.
So there's nothing spiritually wrong with me?
No. It's like being diabetic. You know, it's like you can eat wrong and chemicals get released from your liver in a weird way. You know, you've been eating gluten and shit. And then eventually you've got a chemical imbalance from your liver. And something clicked and now you're diabetic forever, right? So, like, if you keep doing something too much, eventually there's a dopamine up, right? And you're kind of screwed up for life.
So what does that mean? I can get addicted to everything so I can't enjoy anything?
Yeah, that's pretty much what it means.
The addict people said something about me filling a hole.
Well, who's not filling a hole, right? You know, I mean, what kind of bullshit is that? So, let's talk about genetics now. You still have time?
Yeah, no, this is great.
Okay, let me get some
when you get under stress, you're probably going to seek out that pleasurable feeling so that you can get more of these made. So I think that this is really, really fascinating to understand. But now I want to talk to you about something. Is dopamine release does not have to come from just external things. You know, when you're dependent on another person, you know, kind of love junkie thing that I was telling you about, when you're dependent on the other person to release your dopamine, then that puts you in a very vulnerable state. Is you can release your own dopamine, and this is something that you need to learn, is by taking on new challenges. Now, the key is that you need to take on challenges that are good. So, for example, some women, they have, or men too probably, but it tends to be a little bit more of a female thing, is the shopping addiction. Is look, when you buy something new, you're buying, you know, some new clothes, the novelty of getting something new will release the dopamine. But then if you do this too much, you know that you're going to spend too much of your money. And so now you get stressed out about the money that you're spending. And so now you've depleted these, so now you need to buy something new so that you can have more dopamine to facilitate the loss of these. sexual addiction is the sex is going to release the dopamine. That's a orgasm release, right? But then you're getting the pleasure from, let's say, someone that you're not supposed to, or doing it in a place, I don't know, something like that. You're getting your sexual pleasure from an area where you're not supposed to be, or it's socially unacceptable. So now you get very stressed about that, and so now you need more of the dopamine, and it becomes this big addiction. So when we have something that produces massive, massive pleasure, we know about that pleasure, the brain knows about it, but then when you have the simultaneous push of, oh my gosh, I got such great pleasure, but that was kind of wrong for me to do it, it creates this ultimate high, but you depleted the epinephrine and norepinephrine, so now you need more of it. So you kind of, what I'm trying to get at is, I'm trying to get at a lot of things actually, is be careful of the doors that you open. You choose something that could give you the ultimate rush, but now once your brain knows that that ultimate rush is there, it wants that all the time. So be careful what you go ahead and open that door to. When you have that huge rush of the combination of, I'm doing something that I never thought that I would ever do before, and I'm kind of not supposed to be doing it, it's kind of wrong, and you have the simultaneous release of all three, it's going to create this rush that could be dangerous. But on the other hand, we want to know that, we don't want to shy away from stress, because stress is what gives us life. I don't think it's possible to feel this sense of life and satisfaction without taking on new challenges. And then one other thing to gain from this is that to understand that when you're under stress, you have to be very careful. You need to have a lot of social support, because people will do things under stress and seek out kind of negative behaviors to release this pleasure molecule that they wouldn't do when they're not under stress. Okay, last thing on this particular thing is, what I was getting at is you can release your own dopamine. You don't have to rely on other people to release it. And this is kind of where creativity comes in, is taking your unique talents and skills and taking on new challenges. So creativity can be in many different aspects of life, but so that you're not dependent on an outside source of dopamine, you have to generate it from within. So trying new things and taking on new challenges is what's going to give you the personal pleasure where you're not a drain on someone else. Okay, so hopefully this explained a lot about your life. And one last thing is, it's interesting that dopamine is not only associated with our pleasure and our satisfaction, but it doesn't come from being sedentary. Also, it's associated with movement. So I like to say satisfaction is not possible without action. It's taking action each day to grow and learn new things and express yourself. That's what you'd have to do. When someone's recovering from some type of addiction, I think that the absolute best thing for that person is for them to replace that addiction of the drug, of the sexual addiction, gambling addiction, shopping addiction. It's really essential for them to replace that addiction with a healthy addiction. The healthy addiction to something creative is, you're still going to need that dopamine. Your brain has not changed. You need the dopamine. And in fact, some people that are more at risk for addiction, they probably have more dopamine receptors, or a different level of dopamine receptors, than somebody who's not so much at risk for high addiction. But they need to replace that addiction with something that's healthy. Like a lot of people will turn to God, and I'm going to turn to religion, and maybe God will provide for me things. God will always be there for me. You've still got that sense of uncertainty, but I'm turning to this, or creativity. I'm going to learn to paint, or I'm going to learn to sew, or I'm going to learn how to build things, but I'm going to take my gifts and express them, and it becomes an addiction of, I feel great taking on new challenges. Okay, let's go on to